Hello and welcome to World Insight with me, Tian Wei, coming to you from Beijing on CGTN. Coming up on today's program, this year's Boao Forum for Asia will kick off this weekend. Amid rising trade tensions, will the four-day gathering come up with solutions toward a world of greater prosperity? And China is making serious effort to put its economic house in order. So I talked to economist Arthur Krober about how China could seize the opportunity in a transition period. You're watching World Insight. The 2018 Boao Forum for Asia is kicking off in China's southernmost province of Hainan this weekend. The four-day gathering carries the theme An Open and Innovative Asia for a World of Greater Prosperity, with Chinese President Xi Jinping scheduled to open the forum with a keynote speech. Amid rising trade frictions and protectionism worldwide, this year's forum comes at a critical moment for political and business leaders to figure out a new impetus to regional and even world economic growth.
The Boao Forum will last from April 8 to 11 in Hainan Province's town, which the forum is named after, with the opening ceremony scheduled for April 10. Chinese President Xi Jinping will deliver a keynote speech at the opening ceremony.
This is President Xi's third time to attend the Boao Forum for Asia as the country's president, which shows strong support and commitment from himself and the Chinese government.
The forum will kick off amid escalating China-U.S. trade tensions. U.S. President Donald Trump is considering an additional $100 billion worth of tariffs on China, sending jitters over economic growth.
Just now, I mentioned China has been fully prepared. If the US side announces the list for the added $100 billion tariff, we will immediately fight back, and we will take any measures to fight back.
Earlier this week, the Trump administration proposed tariffs on a list of 1,300 Chinese products worth about $50 billion. Beijing matched the new U.S. duties with retaliatory tariffs against U.S. products.
The Chinese and the U.S. economies have been deeply interrelated, with both sides' interests highly intertwined. The U.S. is run by attempting to benefit from protectionism. Both China and the U.S. are major countries in the world who should respect each other and treat each other as equals. The U.S. has found the wrong opponent in hitting China with trade sanctions.
At this year's forum, China will likely unveil new measures on reform and opening up. Many hope the Boao gathering, which has played a unique role in pushing forward regional integration, would help with the trade issues between China and the U.S.
So what's at stake at the Boao Forum this year? Let's ask our panelists with us here in Beijing studio. Xu Sitao, who is the chief economist of Deloitte China. He's going to go to Boao this year. Welcome. Meanwhile, in Shanghai, we are joined by Zheng Yuhuang, the chairman of Yu Capital, who's a former White House fellow. Welcome, sir. And in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia, we invited Tan Sri Rustam, who is the chairman and chief executive of the Institute of Strategic and International Studies in Malaysia. Welcome as well. I want to start with you, Mr. Xu, in Beijing. Now, China-U.S. trade confrontation is always on the top of the headlines. Will that become, once again, the key issue in Boao?
Oh, most definitely, because this is what everyone is watching. And so far, we have seen some tit for tat, shall we say, from both sides. So now I think it's time to see cooler head prevail.
Cooler head and logic, will that prevail? Mr. Rustam, what is your assessment?
I agree with that view that there should be cooler heads prevailing here, because in any war, for that matter, is trade or physical war, there are mostly more losers than winners. So I think it is important that everyone looks at the situation fairly and begin to assess what would be the damage done not only to their own economies but to the economies of the rest of the world. Take ASEAN, for example. ASEAN countries trade with China and trade with the US, and if there's any trade war between China and the United States, it will affect us too.
It is still in the process of confrontation rather than the overall war. And the U.S. side has put out a list that would take about 60 days for consultation, certainly, from all sides inside the American society. While the U.S. and China side has not exercised its list of so-called tariffs either. It is waiting for the reaction coming from the U.S. side. Having said that, though, Mr. Huang, let me go to you. How is this issue likely to shape people's discussion about international rules and about the future competition and cooperation among economies? This is crucial for Boao.
Yes. So I think there's a real fear in the United States. There's a fear and realization that China is not going to be like the United States. There's also a fear and realization that, the U.S. has lost out to China in manufacturing, and American companies are becoming less competitive in the Chinese market. And now there's a fear, a real fear, that Americans might lose out in technology and innovation to China. So I think the whole world will be watching, because this is not just about Trump. This might be the opening chapter of how do we address this fear in a systematic, global way that benefits all of us.
This is not only an issue of fear, but also an issue of fair competition. It is an issue of development with the fair amount of access. Mr. Xu, from your perspective, this year's Boao also has the issue of openness and innovation. That is the key words, isn't it, in the theme? So how is this likely to be interacting with these two key words?
These two key words are very much related. And I think openness, clearly, just like the gentleman from KL has eloquently alluded, this part of the world, not just ASEAN, Asia in general, is so leveraging on international trade. China versus United States, we are more depending on international trade, trade accounting for, at one point, almost 50% of GDP, now it's 40%. So we are relying on international trade. So openness is very important. And of course, innovation, as the gentleman in Shanghai has alluded, China has made huge strides in innovation in past few years. But of course, further innovation depending on a more open society.
Now, regionalization, globalization, Mr. Rastam, has been, we know, the logic of our world today. But we also know that has aroused some different kinds of emotions and feelings, sentiments in different parts of the world. So the thing is, you need to develop, you have to focus on this. But on the other side of it is political rhetoric keep on using these words to arouse different kinds of mentalities. So Mr. Rastam, your take here, will Boao this year help to streamline the most important point?
Yes, I think it's important for people to focus on the theme of the conference itself. As you have said, it's open and innovative Asia. But of course, I don't think the discussion should be just on Asia. It's the whole world, that the future of the whole world is at stake here. And I think appeals to populism or appeals to protectionism should be tempered with a clear view of what is at stake for the future of the world, because it is not just about trade, it is not just about economic development, it is also about other things that are important to humankind for the future. People should be able to discuss this in an open and a frank manner. Thank you.
Mr. Rastam, I know you are also going to Boao. Remember 2 years ago, Jack Ma from Alibaba, whose company is based in China, had been talking about EWTP. Since then, with your country, Malaysia, there has been some kinds of platform being used and established. How will emerging, developing economies working together be able to test all of these new case studies? And will these kinds of models be, in a way, be able to be shared by the others? That is a key question. When you don't have the other players, important players, work, you have to work on your own. So here's the thing. Will that workable in the other parts of the world, Mr. Rastam?
I'm sure it would. You know, the collaboration between Alibaba and Malaysia involves the development of a digital free trade zone, and the government here is very committed to ensuring that that works. It would help something like 60,000 entrepreneurs in the country. And we expect it to grow, and we expect it to be a model that will be used by other countries in the region too, because e-commerce is growing, digitization is growing. We cannot prevent these things from happening. So the best thing is to embrace it and be part of it. And I think it is a good model to follow, and of course we expect other players to be able to come in also. Not only in Malaysia, but also in the ASEAN region, because there are tremendous potentials here in ASEAN.
Mr. Huang, you yourself is an entrepreneur. So the developing and emerging economies are working very hard to promote the entrepreneurship and promote the innovative spirit. But at the end of the day, there's likely to be some kinds of competition, while at the same time, a lot of cooperation with, quote-unquote, the West or the United States. Mr. Huang, what is your take about this potential tipping point?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, this world is fiercely competitive and is becoming incredibly global. An entrepreneur based, in a small village in Malaysia might become a unicorn in a couple of years because of the advent of mobile internet and other technologies. So we have an opportunity to really bring the best technology and the best talents to the global stage from anywhere in the world. And I think in a way that's the beauty. Now, of course, when you have talents from around the world coming together, it's going to be fiercely competitive. And the key is if countries could come together to set a level playing ground for everybody so that we can actually all compete fairly, also in the process creating a common standard. And I think the common standard is very key, because we want to be able to use technology innovation anywhere we want to go. We don't want to have to, put on a different set of iPhones here and a different set of, smartphones over there. We want to have common set of technologies and innovation. So those are the elements that are interplay all the time.
Is political barrier the biggest issue for us, Mr. Xu?
Yeah, to a certain degree, yes.
Well, I guess to you, to a certain degree, and then is there a way to address that, Mr. Xu?
I think the best way to address political differences is clearly you need to have more frank conversation and a debate, dialogue, as what a Malaysian gentleman has proposed. So from that perspective, I think Boao plays a very important role.
Political difference is one thing, but political barrier is much more serious than that. I mean, political barrier could prevent businesses from spreading around the world, could set barriers for certain kinds of businesses and set barriers for technology transfer, intellectual property rights transfer, all of these things. So, Mr. Xu, political barriers, is that what is facing us right now? Or we are just talking about, the business world need to make their own efforts? What exactly is it?
I don't think can separate political difference from economic reality, but in the near term, I think if we can somehow mitigate protectionism and improving connectivity, and I think political differences could be reduced.
Mr. Rostam, the world economy seems to be picking up, whether it's developing, emerging, and even developed economies. But now we are seeing big economies into this war trade confrontation provoked this time by the United States. And then we also see the commodity price going up and down, stock market not stable at all as a result. And we also see other geopolitical issues hanging over there. To you, Mr. Rostam, who have been studying the issue for a long time, so how do you see all of these factors put together? Openness, innovation, is it ever possible?
Innovation will continue anyway, whether governments or political leaders are paying attention to these things. We can see that the private sector, the business world is moving in that direction. Now, the problem is back to the question of political barriers. Sometimes governments are behind the curve when it comes to these things. So it is important that that governments and leaders understand what is at stake here, and I think they do. They do. That's why some behave in a manner to protect their own interests, or rather their country's interests. It is, I think, natural, quite natural for everyone to want to protect their own interests. But I think it is possible for innovation, for openness to continue with dialogue, as has been mentioned, with cool heads prevailing, with people understanding what is going on around us. And I think the opportunities are there for this to be discussed at Boao. Thank you.
Mr. Huang, there are a lot of exciting initiatives originated coming from Asia, since we're talking about Boao. The ASEAN community is an amazing example. Meanwhile, you also have initiatives like a Belt and Road Initiative coming from China. You also have Community of Shared Future, that is one vision Chinese President Xi Jinping put out there, I believe also from Boao. So will all of these be able to be inspirational enough to bring us some kinds of roadmap for the near future? Mr. Huang, I know it's a big question, but I do want to invite your opinions.
Yep. Well, first of all, I want to address this point about innovation, because innovation is not 100% positive or all rosy, right? We know that it creates tremendous dislocation and disruptions in society. I have a lot of friends who are very highly educated, but sometimes they come to me and say, you know what, I'm kind of afraid. I'm afraid if my kids will have jobs 20, 30, 40 years down the line. So I think there is fear, and we have to be cognizant that when fears arise, we naturally seek our government to protect us. So there's a real element there. Now, of course, hopefully our governments will help us come together and to create more opportunities for all of us using technology. Now, in terms of what you just said, I mean, Boao has always been a perfect forum for countries to come together to talk about issues ranging from, financial innovation to green energy to international development, and I think this year is not an exception. The fact that President Xi is speaking is really giving it the prominence that it deserves. And one of the things I'm curious to see is the leadership, the senior leadership of China has just been confirmed. And I would love to see if there are any specific announcements for reforms. Because given the brain power and the leadership that's available, I could see tremendous opportunities for reforms that will not only benefit China, but everyone associated and working with China.
Mr. Xi, there's already some news coming out that some measures of reforms and opening up new policies likely to be unveiled in this year's Boao. What areas, Mr. Xi, given your knowledge about China, should we look into about these new measures? And once China takes a step, can we expect other countries to do the same or at least to follow suit?
I think when we look at reform liberalization in general, I think right now the critical issue is really about market access and opening up of service sector. In general, manufacturing sector in China is quite open and competitive. But the service sector, I think there's a lot of room for opening up. And also from consumer perspective, and welfare can be improved for consumers at large. So again, this backdrop, I think right now the expectations are quite high in terms of service sector liberalization. And the Chinese government has been emphasizing repeatedly, for example, national treatment for foreign companies, so on and so forth, precisely because this emphasis on national treatment, again, there will be a higher expectation on market access.
Mr. Huang, even though you see the trade confrontation, but you also see economies are determined enough to bring out their own blueprint. I do not want to be blurred when it comes to their road ahead in terms of reform opening up. That is what I'm talking about, China. So, Mr. Huang, do you see any specific areas that this time could be the focus, Mr. Huang?
Well, I think in the larger picture, especially between U.S. and China, there are three areas of focus, right? From the U.S. perspective, it's American presence in China. From China's perspective, it's Chinese presence in the American market. And I think there's a third added perspective, which is U.S. and China potentially working on global initiatives and projects. So I think those are the three overarching domains for the two countries. Now within it, there are definitely specific disciplines you could talk about, ranging from different technologies to different regions, involving different partners. So I think there's definitely still a lot of areas for collaborations, and this forum has always been a wonderful venue for people to come together to find a common ground.
Mr. Rastan?
Yes, I think it's important that people are able to come together on this, and I find it rather interesting that the Prime Minister of Singapore, for example, is going to be there at Boao.
Yes, and also from the
Singapore
Philippines
is
as
now
well.
the chair of ASEAN. From the Philippines, yes. What is important to me here is that Singapore is chair of ASEAN this year, and the theme for the ASEAN Chairmanship of Singapore is innovation and resilience. And at the end of this month, the ASEAN leaders are going to get together in Singapore for the ASEAN Summit. And so I'm sure that some of the things that are being discussed or that will be discussed at Boao would also resonate in the discussion in the ASEAN Summit at the end of this month.
Before we go, I do want to invite your final thoughts about what shall we expect in this year's Boao. Of course, Boao Forum is one of those important regional and international forums that you see around the world. But this year, it is very special because we mentioned several things. The world is changing fast. I don't need to go into details about how it's been changing. Secondly, the new Chinese leadership is coming up for the second term. What might be there? And thirdly, we see a lot of regional development and innovation. With this as the backdrop, Mr. Rastan, final words from you. What shall we and what would you like to expect in this year's Boao?
Well, as I see it, we would expect something coming from the President, from President Xi Jinping. I recall that the Belt and Road Initiative, for example, was followed up following his speeches in Indonesia and Kazakhstan. He made the announcement at Boao on the way forward for the Belt and Road Initiative. So I think we expect that there will be a major speech coming from the President at this forum this year.
All right, Mr. Huang?
Well, I think whatever happens, the whole world will be watching. Because especially how China responds to the world, I think many countries will assume that's how China might negotiate with them in the future. And of course, how the U.S. might respond to China after President Xi's speech, many countries will also assume that's how the U.S. will respond in terms of negotiations. So I think that's where it's going to get very interesting and very exciting. And that's why so many countries, I think, will be paying attention to this.
You're adding a lot of spotlights to this year's Boao, Mr. Huang. And finally, before we go, Mr. Xu, finally from you.
It would be really good if we could hear something not just concrete, but earth-shattering in terms of liberalization in service sectors. That would put China on high moral ground against the backdrop of U.S.-China trade frictions, and I think that will also fundamentally diffuse trade tensions, protectionism in the long run.
Well, higher moral ground, that seems to be a big phrase to be used. But anyway, for now, I want to thank the three of you. I'll see some of you in Boao. Well, at the same time, thank you so much for joining us.